I'm curious, Jim, what you think this means for the U.S. military. Last time we had you on, we talked about how, back in 2000, the U.S. was kind of gradually shifting its focus to the Asia Pacific, but then it got involved in the Middle East. The Navy took on a support role for ground forces, and that sort of allowed China's Navy to grow rapidly, while the U.S. Navy kind of was a support role. Over the past few years, the military has again been focusing more heavily on the Indo-Pacific now. Do you think that shift is at risk with new threats in the Middle East?
I think right now with this administration, that from everything that I've seen over the last week here, with the president's statement and the statements from the Secretary of Defense and chairman, they're not going back in. So it seems very clear that this administration is committed to leaving no matter what the cost. So that's another probably podcast to discuss that, but that's the message that they have sent. We're not going to risk any more American lives to save 10,000 Americans or 60,000 of our former Afghani friends. The implications of that are significant, but from a military perspective, do I see us all of a sudden, ramping up like we did after 9/11 and, going in with a full force and diverting military resources from the Pacific? I don't see that in the near term. I just don't see that as a possibility. But does that then mean that we're safe in the Pacific is probably the next question. And I don't think we're safe in the Pacific. If you recall, during the Obama administration, they came out and the Navy said we would have a 60-40 split. 60% of the U.S. Navy would be in the Pacific and 40% in the Atlantic. It was always theoretically 50-50. And I remember talking to some four-star admirals at the time when these announcements came out, and one very wise four-star told me once, said, Jim, what it really means is it's not that we're going to move 10% from the Atlantic into the Pacific. It's really about when they reduce our forces by 10%, we'll take that out of the Atlantic. And so in essence, you've never really grown your force strength in the Pacific. And so that's really the truth of the matter is that we've never really substantially grown our force strength in the Pacific. Sure, we put in 2,500 Marines in Darwin. We've had a few new intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms that have come into the theater. We've got the Virginia-class nuclear fast attack submarine. But in terms of overall force structure, in terms of total numbers of ships and aircraft and submarine, we're relatively the same we've been for the last 30 years. And so the question really becomes, or not question, the observation that I have is when you think about that and you think about the size of our force in the Pacific, and you think about how fast and how large the PLA has grown, and then you look at what happened in Afghanistan, you remember that mass matters, numbers matter. The Taliban was able to surround and take control of the whole country of Afghanistan because they had the numbers. And they were able to surround Kabul airport because they had the numbers. We withdrew our numbers. We withdrew our military presence out of Bagram at the end of July, and now we're reaping the consequences for that. I heard somebody on a podcast, say that, General Petraeus had advised both the Biden and Trump and previous administration. They said, if you want to get out of Afghanistan, you're still going to have to leave some small force of people there to maintain stability. He said around 2,000-3,000 people. And we had been doing that for the last 18 months. But when we removed those, it was a green light for the Taliban. It's the same process in the Pacific. And at some point, the Chinese are going to say, I got a green light right now. Not only do I have an administration that appears not intent on, taking action, but now I have the mass, I have the numerical superiority to achieve my goals. And so this is really a really dangerous time. And, we've seen the Chinese press over the last 48 hours, 72 hours, make a lot of references to what this event in Afghanistan means for Taiwan. And even today, the Global Times just put out an editorial remarking on apparently yesterday, President Biden made the statement that, we made a sacred commitment to Article 5 with NATO, and it applies also to Japan, South Korea, and even Taiwan. And everybody, said, what? That's never been said before by a U.S. president. And so China is now in the process, the global times, of helping defend Joe Biden by saying, well, he probably didn't know what he was saying. He didn't mean it. He's under a lot of stress from what's going on in Afghanistan. Because if he knew what he said, well, that would be the red line, and we would change everything, and we would, that would be the reason for us to go to war to take Taiwan. So, China right now is in the catbird seat. They see what's happened in Afghanistan. They can see a demoralized nation in many ways. 18 months of people being cowed into wearing masks at the whim of one person, being forced to have vaccines to be able to go into a restaurant, being forced to have their children taught bizarre school curricula. That's all I'll say on that. A lot of things that are just falling apart in this nation. And China sees all that. And they're seeing what they believe is an erosion of the American spirit, the American will. What we used to call in the Reagan administration, the city on the shining hill. They mock that now. They mock that thinking and say that was all made up stuff. It was all propaganda. And you guys were never a city on a shining city on a hill, even though we have, millions of people that have come to America because they wanted to come there to have that taste of freedom. And so China's using soft power and information warfare to take what's happening in America to continue to demoralize us, to continue to divide us, to continue to separate us, to continue to promote their brand internationally, and to reinforce the strength of the party inside China. And at some point, they've told the people of Taiwan, you're going to be ours, and it's going to be rather quickly. And so the question is, when does that quickly happen, and how does it happen, and what does Taiwan do? And, that's really the big question is, what does Taiwan do?
So, Jim, one of the questions I have about, you watch Chinese propaganda on a pretty regular basis. Do you think that this is just their political warfare, psychological warfare stuff, where they're just trying to demoralize Taiwan, they're trying to demoralize the U.S.?
And just to be clear, what Chinese state-run media is saying is that, hey, Taiwan, look at how the U.S. abandoned Afghanistan. They'll abandon you when we invade, not if, once we invade. So, you should probably strike a deal now.
Yeah. So do you think that this is just like a psychological warfare tactic about demoralization, or do you think that the Chinese Communist Party leadership, they honestly believe that the U.S. is, on the retreat, on the way down, and that would mean that now is the time to act?
I think if you had asked me that, okay, first of all, it's definitely an information tactic. It's Sun Tzu. It's, winning without fighting. It's all of that. But they're not separated. We in the West kind of see it, well, is it non-kinetic or is it kinetic? And it's together. It's woven together. And so it's a fabric. And we have to do all these things to pressurize and screw with the minds of the Taiwanese in order to get them to finally capitulate. But when they don't, we have this fabric, it's woven, and we're going to flow right into armed conflict. And we kind of see it as this, like, if this, then. It's a, Greek Aristotelian logic, if this, then this. And I think in the Chinese mind, it's a tapestry, and they're moving across that tapestry. And so how do you light that tapestry on fire and cause it to not come into play? And that's really our challenge. And I think a year ago, I think they probably still were, talking big, talking strong, but behind closed doors in Zhongnanhai, they're probably sitting around saying, they got this many carriers, and they got this many nuclear boomers, and they got this many submarines, and they're operating here, and they got they got the biggest air force, and they can resupply, and they got logistics that we don't have, and blah, blah, blah. And they were probably, they respect that. But I think over the last 18 months, and this is now what's happened in Afghanistan, they're going to be examining all of this right now. When you hear stories about British SAS commanders in screaming matches with U.S. Army commanders about whether or not they'll go outside the wire to go get people to bring them back into the airport to rescue them, which is out in the press now this week. It's already been out there. When China will have that information. They'll probably have more information. They'll have signals intelligence. They'll have human intelligence. They're probably soaking up and getting a real sense of what's going on inside the U.S. military right now, and at least of those people that are in Afghanistan, and judging that from other statements that are made by other military leaders. And I think you can only come to the conclusion that they're going to be more confident that the United States is weaker than it was a year and a half ago. Does that mean they think we're a pushover and that we won't respond? No. But that's why they're building, 350 ICBM silos out in Western China. This is the last piece. Once those silos go live, and once they have a nuclear arsenal that's at parity with the United States, things are going to dramatically change because they're not going to be pushed around anymore. And they're going to start signaling and using nuclear weapons as a blackmail tool. They've had this no first use policy since they first tested. That's going to go away. They won't formally put it away, but you can guarantee behind closed doors, they're going to remind people that you really want to screw with us when we have just as many nukes as you. And so I think this is really something that has alarmed me, that we're not talking about this. It hasn't been brought up at all in this last, 2 or 3 months since the first reports came out in April. The Federation of Scientists and things of those kind of specialty websites have talked about them, but it hasn't been a national issue. This administration has literally, I know Secretary of State Blinken has made a couple of comments on it, but this building of these ICBM silos and the Chinese developing a nuclear arsenal that's going to be on par or greater than the United States. This is, as I wrote in an editorial, this is the Chinese Sputnik moment. This is a major event. When the Russians, the Soviets, launched the Sputnik satellite into space in 1957, it shocked America's intellectuals. It shocked Washington, D.C., because we didn't think the Soviet Union had any way, shape, or form could have put a satellite into space before us, at all, let alone before us. And now here we are at this point where China's basically saying, in the space of April, May, June, July, 3 or 4 months, we now have commercial satellite imagery that shows 340 plus individual ICBM silos. Well, people say, well, we don't know what's really in them. They could just be drilling holes in the sand and they're just, deceiving us. Okay, go ahead. Risk your future on that kind of an assessment. We had assessments in the past about China's commitment to nuclear development. We know what the technologies that they've given to other nations. And we know that they're committed to having a strong nuclear arsenal. They've told us that in writing. And now we're seeing that manifested in action. And so this is going to dramatically change the balance of power in the world. And why we're not talking about it is beyond comprehension to me.